Even if you didn't watch this, you probably know that it happened.
The outcome of this election is not what we wanted, not what we fought for, not what we voted for, but hear me when I say, the light of America's promise will always burn bright.
And for some, Kamala's concession speech might have felt a little like deja vu, because a few years earlier, this happened.
This is not the outcome we wanted or we worked so hard for, and I'm sorry that we did not win this election for the values we share and the vision we hold for our country. But I feel pride and gratitude for this wonderful campaign that we built together. I know how disappointed you feel because I feel it too.
Whoa, Hills. Speak for yourself. We here at Ty's Hot Mess History are not disappointed because we have a good old story to get to today. Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton are only two of the most recent women who have run for the office of President of the United States and lost. There were a number of women who came before them. Before Hillary, there was Carol Moseley Braun in 2004. Before her, there was Elizabeth Dole, wife of Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. She ran in 2000. Before her, there was Lenora Falani, the first Black woman to be on the ballot in all 50 states, heading the New Alliance Party ticket in 1988. Before her, there was Sonia Johnson, who ran as a candidate of the U.S. Citizens Party in 1984. Before her, Linda Jenness ran as the candidate for the Social Workers Party in 1972. That was the same year as Shirley Chisholm's historic campaign as the first Black woman to run for president. But I want to make something very clear about that, because most people often get it wrong and say that she was on the ballot. She wasn't. She lost in the Democratic primary race, so her name was not on the ballot in the general election that year. George McGovern outpaced Shirley Chisholm and his other opponents by a substantial margin, and it was his name that was on the ballot. He lost to President Richard Nixon. Before Shirley Chisholm, there was Margaret Chase Smith, who ran in the Republican primary. She came in dead last, losing to Barry Goldwater, and he lost to President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Then, 8 years before Margaret Smith, there was Belva Ann Lockwood, who ran for president on the ticket of the Equal Rights Party in 1884 and 1888. But even before her, there was the topic of our story today, Victoria California Claflin Woodhull, the first woman to ever run for president of the United States. And she did it in 1872. Her story has it all. Shady, no-good parents, an absolutely horrid first husband who met her when she was 14 and he was twice her age. We're going to take a very deep dive into that marriage. A sister who was her partner in crime, and then later her business partner. She also got into an entanglement with Cornelius Vanderbilt, one of the richest men in the world at the time. And of course, Victoria's historic presidential campaign, which involved a bit of a scandal with Frederick Douglass. We're also going to take a dive into her scandal involving Henry Ward Beecher. He is the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe. She is the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. See, Henry Ward Beecher was a minister, and he loved his flock, especially the women in it. He loved some of them in ways that were highly inappropriate, and Victoria may or may not have exposed him in the newspaper that she and her sister owned. It's a lot. A historic run for president and a total hot mess. Let's get into it. But first, if you like these videos about the most scandalous people from yesteryear who make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can know every time that I upload content. And please hit that thumbs up and share to support this video for free. Whether you're watching or listening, thank you for letting me be a part of your day. Now, on to why you are here. Victoria Claflin Woodhull was called many things in her day. Audacious was one of the nicer words used to describe her. Scandalous was another one, and it was accurate. Scandal was in her bloodline. Victoria's story begins with her roots. planted firmly in scandal. Her father, the dubious Reuben Buckman Claflin, simply known as Buck, came from the Massachusetts-based Scottish-American Claflin family, a rather prominent family that boasted a governor in its family tree. But Buck was from the compromised branch of the Claflin family tree. He was an attorney, a snake oil salesman, and an all-around con artist. Buck married the equally questionable Roxana Hummel. Roxana was born to unwed parents, which was completely taboo in the early 1800s, and Roxana was also illiterate. Together, she and Buck produced a litter of troublemakers. 10 children total, only 6 reached adulthood, and of those 6, each one was seemingly more problematic than the last. Yet, from this dubious brood, 2 rose to prominence as social marvels of their age: Victoria and her younger sister, Tennessee. Victoria was born into poverty in Homer, Ohio, a rural frontier town. Her birth date was September 23, 1838. She was child number 7 out of the 10. Days were generally gloomy for Victoria and her siblings. Their father could rarely scrape together enough money to pay bills and put food on the table. Victoria lived a life of what felt like a never-ending cycle of little comfort and lots of abuse, specifically starvation, whippings, and lack of education. Her parents only allowed her to attend school for 3 years off and on, even though teachers at Homer's Methodist Church thought that she was a brilliant child. Buck and Roxana thought that Victoria's time would better be spent earning money for the family. That meant joining her father in his shady snake oil business sales and any other crooked schemes to make a quick buck, telling fortunes, selling homemade medicines, and traveling medicine shows. By the time Victoria turned 11, the Woodhull family had no choice but to travel when their family got run out of town because of one of his schemes. So, Buck acquired the title to a local grist mill, a big piece of equipment that grinds grain into flour. It was already rotting and no longer useful when he bought it. Ever the con man and always looking for a way to get paid without, working, he went to his insurance company and heavily insured the useless mill. And only days later, it mysteriously burned down to the ground. Aw, shucks. Somehow, he was able to get the insurance money quickly. Now, we can all agree that what he did was deceitful, but at least his family would be better off, right? Wrong. Buck took that money and vanished. He left his family stranded, wife and children. They had to stay behind and live in shame because of his actions. It took about 2 seconds for officials to solve Buck's arson and fraud, and that was it for the Woodhull clan. Nobody wanted any of them in Homer anymore. The town was so against them that the locals held a benefit of sorts to raise the money to fund a relocation for the rest of the family. They felt like Buck had left his trash behind. The good people of Homer meant business. They were poor, but they raised so much money that they were able to give Roxana enough money to take her little spawns not only away from Homer, but away from the state of Ohio altogether. Now, it's often said that women marry some version of their father. I want you to keep this story about Buck in your memory for when we get to Victoria's first husband. And we're almost there. I know that she's only 11 at this point in the story, but we're almost there. When Buck ran out of bucks after abandoning his family, he was all too happy to reunite with them because he wanted to be a stand-up guy and do the right thing this time. Just kidding. He wanted to put them back to work and make him some more money. Yeah, it was time to restart the Healing Act. It was the perfect scheme for Buck, who thought that work was a forbidden 4-letter word, because now his daughters were older. They could take on the brunt of the labor. But not only were they older, they were pretty young girls who could attract the attention of men. It was going to be so easy for Buck to make money off of Victoria in Tennessee. It was the most convenient family reunion for Buck. He and his family were on the road, traveling from town to town across Ohio with Victoria and Tennessee captivating audiences as spiritualists and hypnotists. In every town, the sisters took the stage, using their spiritual gifts to entertain, bewilder, and scandalize. In this act, they were the stars, bold, unrestrained, and unapologetically provocative. leaving each town buzzing with tales of the bewitching Claflin sisters. The Claflin family's unity was built on shaky foundations, to say the least. Now that they had money coming in from their phony medicine sales and healing, tensions among them increased because they didn't trust each other. One family member was always eyeing the other, trying to be sure that the money was evenly split. None of them were ever satisfied. The constant quarrels and schemes of Buck and Roxana eventually led Victoria to make a bold move. A smart move. She persuaded her younger sister, Tennessee, to break away from the family's scheme and form their own duo of deception. This way, they didn't have to fight over money anymore. They left that to their parents and their other siblings. Even from a very young age, Victoria was no fool. She understood why Tennessee would be the perfect business partner for her. Tennessee was beautiful and charming. With her sister at her side, getting men to fork over their money would be easy. But while Tennessee wielded her physical charm, Victoria possessed something even more formidable. Though both equally stunning, Victoria had an added edge. She was a fast thinker with a shrewd mind. She was quick-witted and resourceful, traits that made her an exceptional manipulator. She would need those traits later in life, and she would surely use them. The sister act with Victoria and Tennessee was profitable for a while. The girls were still helping to support their family, but they were able to keep a little more money for themselves after going their own way with their own healing shows. But all of that came to an end when Victoria fell sick. Starting the time she hit puberty, she constantly suffered from chills and fever and later rheumatism, a condition marked by inflammation and pain in the joints and muscles. At least, that's what it was called back then. There's no way to be sure 100% of what the name of her condition was. Why do I say this? Because the doctor who treated her was only a doctor because he called himself one. His name was Canning Woodhull, and he practiced medicine in Ohio at the time, a time when no formal medical education or licensing was required. You may have picked up that his last name was Woodhull, and yes, he became Victoria's first husband. He was 28 years old when he was treating, and I use that term loosely, Victoria when she was only 14 years old, and claimed that he fell in love with her while she was his patient. But I won't tell you this part of the story only from my own words. I'm going to share with you some of the direct words of Theodore Tilton. He and Victoria were associates on the same side of an argument. I'll tell you more about him later. But here's what he wrote about Victoria's first marriage, taken from an 1874 edition of the Brooklyn Eagle. I'm sure that you'll know what he wrote versus my commentary. First, he confirms that Victoria was 14 and Canning was 28 when they met, and that the useless Buck and Roxana allowed and encouraged this relationship. After undergoing treatment from the unlicensed doctor, this is what happened next, according to Theodore. Before she entirely recovered, and while looking haggard and sad, one day he stopped her in the street and said, "My little chick, I want you to go with me to the picnic," referring to a projected 4th of July excursion then at hand. Buck and Roxana gave her permission, but Buck told her that she had to buy her own shoes. So she sold apples to collect enough money, and she was able to go to the picnic with Canning. Theodore goes on to write, on coming home from the festival, the brilliant fop, who, tired of the demi-monde ladies, whom he could purchase for his pleasure, and inspired with a sudden and romantic interest in this artless maid, said to her, "My little puss, tell your father and mother that I want you for a wife." End quote. Now, Victoria was not pleased by this offer at all, but she followed the doctor's orders. She went home and told her parents what Dr. Canning said, and they were so happy at the thought of getting rid of a mouth to feed that they happily accepted Canning's proposal. The pair got married 2 months after Victoria turned 15, and things went downhill immediately. Here's what Theodore wrote about their first week of marriage. On the 3rd day after taking his child wife to his lodgings, he broke her heart by remaining away all night at a house of ill repute. Then, for the first time, she learned, to her dismay, that he was habitually unchaste and given to long fits of intoxication. She was stung to the quick. The shock awoke all her womanhood. she grew 10 years older in a single day. That's what he said. So this poor child did the only thing that she could think to do, and that was to fight for her marriage and to try to win her husband back. Victoria had a dreadful time with this man. Theodore continued, quote, 6 weeks after her marriage, during which time her husband was mostly with his cups and his mistresses, she discovered a letter addressed to him in a lady's elegant penmanship saying, "Did you marry that child because she, too, was en famille?" meaning pregnant in French. This was an additional thunderbolt. The fact was that her husband, on the day of his marriage, had sent away into the country a mistress who a few months later gave birth to a child. Squandering his money like a prodigal, he suddenly put his wife into the humblest quarters, where, left mostly to herself, she dwelt in bitterness of spirit, aggravated from time to time by learning of his ordering of baskets of champagne and drinking himself drunk in the company of harlots. Sometimes, with uncommon courage, through rain and sleet, half-clad and shivering, she would track him to his dens, and by the energy of her spirit compel him to return. At other times, all night long, she would watch at the window, waiting for his footsteps, until she heard them languidly shuffling along the pavement, with the staggering reel of a drunken man, in the shameless hours of the morning. End quote. So now she was spending months just praying to God that her husband would somehow start to love her. God was like, no. Theodore goes on. In 15 months after her marriage, while living in a little low-frame house in Chicago in the dead of the winter, with icicles clinging to her bedpost, and attended only by her half-drunken husband, she brought forth in almost mortal agony her firstborn child. End quote. My goodness. So in this season of her life, the only real help that she had was from a next-door neighbor who took pity on her little soul. This woman would bring food for Victoria and her child. She would bring blankets for the baby. It was the only support that Victoria had, because Canning Woodhull was doing nothing except occasionally coming home drunk and drained from his stints with prostitutes. Then, after a few months, Victoria got really sick again. And of course, her husband, the good doctor, was nowhere to be found. Roxana just happened to stop by for a visit and found Victoria in such a bad state that it looked like she was about to die. For once, Roxana acted like a mother and took Victoria home and nursed her until she was well. So Victoria left her parents' house to go back to her marital home, as the standards of the time dictated that she should. And when she got there, her husband was there. Not exactly waiting on her return, more like surprised by her return. You see, he was there with one of his prostitutes who had spent the night. From the Brooklyn Eagle, quote, she returned to her own to be horror-struck at discovering that her bed had been occupied the night before by her husband in company of a wanton of the streets, and that the room was littered with remains of their drunken feast. There's more, quote, once, after a month's desertion by him, until she had no money and little to eat, she learned that he was keeping a mistress at a fashionable boarding house under the title of wife. Yeah, so this is me talking. He went right back to cheating, and while she was starving, he had his mistress living the high life. So Victoria pulled herself together in the freezing cold, wearing her nightgown and no proper shoes, and she went to confront Dr. Canning. As Theodore told it, she, quote, entered the house, confronted the household as they sat at table, told her story to the confusion of the paramour and his mistress, and drew tears from all the company, till by a common movement the listeners compelled the harlot to pack her trunk and flee the city, and shamed the husband into creeping like a spaniel back into the kennel, which his wife still cherished as her home. End quote. Now, Victoria had her husband back. Congratulations, I guess. At this point in their marriage, their baby is approaching 2 years of age. Victoria had spent 95% of their union focusing on trying to keep her husband away from alcohol and harlots. Now she could breathe and pay attention to the whole family. And what she realized about her son was just so sad. He had some type of serious developmental issues. There was some type of mental disability, perhaps severe autism or Down syndrome. Of course, the language used then was much more crude. He was called, and I quote, a half-idiot, predestined to be a hopeless imbecile for life, end quote. And it was Victoria's job, even though she was only a child herself, to look after her son and her husband. She thought, as any foolish young girl might think, that a change of scenery would change her husband. So she made the very bold decision to move her tiny family all the way across the country to California. Her hope was that getting Canning away from booze and whores would make him a faithful husband and a loving father. Unfortunately for Victoria, San Francisco also had liquor and prostitutes, and Canning's change of location didn't change his out-of-control desire for liquor and ladies of the night. At 16 years old, in a new city with no support system, it was Victoria who set out to find a job, not Dr. Canning. She answered a want ad for a cigar girl at a bar. She got the job. She didn't last a day, but not because she couldn't do the work. The owner knew that his customers would often speak inappropriately to the women who worked at the bar, and he noticed that Victoria's face would turn blush red when men made nasty remarks to her. So the owner dismissed her. He took her home to her husband and paid her $20. Honestly, that was the first time that I learned of any man being kind to Victoria in all of my research of this story. Even her own father just used her and didn't support her. Anyway, Victoria kept looking for work and was able to secure a job as a seamstress for a well-known actress named Anna Cogswell. One day while stitching up something for Anna, Victoria mentioned that she would need to find another job because the seamstress work didn't cover her bills. And of course, Dr. Canning wasn't contributing a dime to monthly household expenses. So, the actress suggested to Victoria that she might take to the stage too, and she did. Victoria auditioned for a supporting role and got the part in a play called New York by Gaslight. Her character was called Country Cousin. It doesn't sound too glamorous, but it was the 1860s, and she was now earning $52 a week. That's equivalent to earning over $1,900 a week today in 2024. Victoria's money problems were finally over. Then, after only months of being on the stage, and all of her fellow actors telling her to make acting her career, Victoria left it all behind after she had a vision of her closest sister, Tennessee, telling her to come home. She didn't waste any time. That same day, she gathered up her family and took a train home to Ohio. Reportedly, Tennessee was wearing the same dress in real life as she was wearing in Victoria's vision when she saw her in person after getting off of the train. And from this, another career opportunity popped into Victoria's head. She was meant to be a clairvoyant, a fortune teller. She didn't waste any time at it. She set up shop in Indiana, and people started seeing her and believing in whatever she was saying. She then expanded her business into healing. Maybe she possessed miraculous powers because people believed that she was causing the lame to walk and the deaf to hear. She was making so much money. She started traveling city to city, and she was in demand. One rich client tipped her $5,000. Now, Victoria was financially providing for all of her relatives. According to the Brooklyn Eagle, she earned more than $500,000 in 1869. She had more than enough money, but her heart was still heavy every time she looked at her son. She blamed his disability on herself. She couldn't seem to heal him, so she did the next best thing, in her mind, which was to pray to God for another child, a healthy girl. And it had to be a miracle from God to get her husband away from the prostitutes he loved and sleep with her for a night. Dr. Canning got Victoria pregnant with the child that she prayed for, but while she was carrying the child, in one of his drunken fits, he kicked her in the stomach. Not only did Canning physically abuse Victoria, we know that he cheated on her almost every day of their marriage, and he spent all of the money he made, when he was working, on prostitutes and alcohol. Now that she was making the money, he was spending the allowance he was given on other women and booze. But to top it all off, he would verbally abuse Victoria. He would mock her for being faithful to him and call her a fool for doing so. It wasn't until she was going into labor with her second child, with no one in the house to help her except for her drunken louse of a husband, that she finally asked herself, why should I any longer live with this man? As soon as she was able to get on her feet, she went to Chicago and filed for a divorce. And she got it. Now, this was a big win for Victoria. Divorces were not granted to women in those times just because they wanted them. The status quo was that as long as your husband wanted to keep you around, you belonged to him. Well, this newfound liberty stirred up something in Victoria's soul that she turned into a movement. Victoria's hope was that any woman who found herself in a marriage like hers could have the right to leave it through a lawful divorce and not have to become a social pariah because of it. This was the main pillar of what was called the free love movement. Now, free love in the 1860s had nothing to do with the free love social movement of the 1960s, which promoted a sexually active lifestyle with multiple casual partners. No, for women, Victoria's free love movement sought to erase the stigma of divorce for women and make it easier for them to leave abusive marriages. And immediately after her divorce from Canning Woodhull, this free love group of women are the people Victoria starts associating with. And it is this affiliation that sets the stage for her political career. Victoria relocated to New York and entered into a new partnership, both personal and professional, with Colonel James Blood, a Civil War veteran who had commanded the 6th Missouri Volunteers. Originally from St. Louis, Blood was drawn to Victoria's fiery personality. He shared her defiance of societal norms. They were a good match. They got married. Victoria was joined in New York by her sister, Tennessee, and they continued working as healers and fortune tellers. Speaking of fortune, their work eventually brought them into the orbit of a man who had a massive one, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the powerful railroad magnate. I have to state for the record how beautiful Victoria and Tennessee were. At least that's what was reported about them, and there are a lot of stories that back up this claim, where man after man just seems mesmerized by them and ends up doing whatever the sisters told them to do, or maybe just asked them to do, using their feminine charms. And Vanderbilt was unusually rich, but he too was just a man, and fell for their charisma exactly like other men before him had done. But Cornelius Vanderbilt had more to offer than the average man who paid Victoria and Tennessee to have his fortune read. Now, this next thing that I'm going to tell you is a rumor, but it's written in so much of the research about Victoria that I don't mind sharing it. The rumor is that the Claflin sisters gave Vanderbilt some stock tips that paid off big time. But the next part of their story is a fact. In February of 1870, Vanderbilt helped the sisters to launch Woodhull, Claflin and Company, becoming the first women to establish a brokerage firm on Wall Street. And in a very short time, Victoria and Tennessee found themselves $700,000 richer. That's $16 million today. So it does make sense that if the rumors were true, that Cornelius would have helped the women to start their own business as a repayment or returning the favor. The press articles about them refer to them as the bewitching brokers and the queens of finance. And this was great, but Victoria wanted more. The brokerage firm was not the goal, but a means to a greater goal. She envisioned a platform to champion causes close to her heart, including women's rights, labor reform, and the plight of the poor. With the Commodore Vanderbilt as the most prominent connection on their friends list, the Claflin sisters quickly became infamous in New York society. He was 74 at the time, and it was clear that stock tips weren't the only thing that he wanted to share with Tenny. That's a nickname for Tennessee. He openly entertained both sisters, but sometimes only Tennessee. Now, I've already told you that the Claflin sisters were beauties, but Tennessee, there was just something about her. She possessed a rare ability to seduce even the most discerning men, drawing them in with an almost magnetic allure. Her admirers were often men of notable intelligence who found themselves hopelessly captivated by her presence. Yet her charm wasn't limited to her looks alone. Tennessee's allure was enhanced by a cleverness that allowed her to handle these men as playthings, bending them to her will until they became utterly enthralled and often financially entangled by her. Vanderbilt was one of these men. He wasn't so foolish as to get caught up in any major scandals with her. After all, at the time that he met Tennessee, he was a newlywed. He'd just married his second wife, who was also his second cousin, whose name, oddly, was Frank Armstrong Crawford. She was 45 years younger than Cornelius. He didn't want to mess up his new marriage, but it's clear that he had a thing for Tennessee, and she could get whatever she wanted to get from the old man. Nonetheless, their association proved mutually beneficial. With Vanderbilt's advice, the sisters shook the male-dominated financial sector silently, like a hurricane. Their brokerage's success was a testament to their resourcefulness and ambition, and it cemented their place in the history of Wall Street. They were officially important now. For Victoria, this success was cute, but it was only fuel for her larger ambitions. She used her newfound prominence to advocate fiercely for social change, in a time when feminists were often derided as unfeminine or radical. Victoria's elegant demeanor defied expectations. She would make speeches and write news columns to persuade people to join her causes, and it worked. Not all the time, but often. Her beauty and refinement made men take her seriously. To them, she wasn't some ugly, masculine broad who wanted parity with men. She was a dainty little broad who needed men to be nicer to all the broads. All the women. Yes, the typical image of a feminist back then was anything but feminine. Women fighting for their rights were often seen as harsh or mannish or called butch. But Victoria shattered this stereotype. She was an exquisite figure with an exquisite figure, feminine to her core, and when she stood on stage to advocate for equality, the juxtaposition of her femininity with her radical ideas was electrifying. Audiences were shook, titillated, and thoroughly captivated by this scandalous lady banker, who seemed to be fighting for everyone's rights. With money from the brokerage firm still rolling in, and people now listening to what she had to say, that still wasn't enough for Victoria. At those points in her life when she gained a lot of money and anyone else would have taken a break, that's when Victoria would dig her heels in and go for the next goal. Now she was in a position to retire and live extravagantly. Instead, she started a newspaper. Using funds from Woodhull, Claflin and Company, Victoria and Tenney launched Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, a publication that quickly became one of the most provocative ventures in American journalism. The paper's primary mission? To bolster yet another one of Victoria's goals, her campaign for the presidency of the United States, a shocking bid that challenged every conventional notion about women's roles in society. But Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly didn't stop at promoting her political ambitions. It fiercely championed every cause that society's gatekeepers found abhorrent. Pesky little things like equality for women and justice for the poor and working class. The paper's content was radical, bordering on revolutionary. Feminism dominated its pages with articles that struck at the heart of entrenched social injustices. Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly boldly addressed topics that other publications wouldn't touch, like racial inequalities, labor unions, and workers' rights. Before the sisters realized it, they had collected an impressive roster of enemies, from corrupt politicians to self-righteous moralists who thought that women's rights were anti-Christian and immoral. But The paper also ran ads for outrageous quacks and con artists, and it's only understandable that stuff like that made it hard for people to take the newspaper seriously. And, in addition to offering publicity to whack jobs, rumor had it that Tennessee, with her irresistible charm, used the columns of the papers to discreetly blackmail some of her powerful male admirers. If they didn't want her to tell the whole story about whatever they had done, including their names, they would silently comply with whatever she wanted. She played dirty. Meanwhile, Victoria's magnetic allure continued to captivate influential men. Among her admirers was Theodore Tilton, the editor of The Independent, a semi-religious journal with considerable influence. By Victoria's own admission, her affair with Tilton was torrid, lasting a scandalous 6 months. This relationship would eventually explode into one of the greatest crises of her career. By the way, he was the one who wrote that detailed account of her first marriage. Let me tell you how we got here. So now we're at the height of Victoria's fame. It's 1871, and she's mounted a presidential campaign against the incumbent Ulysses S. Grant and the liberal Republican candidate Horace Greeley. Victoria was nominated by the Equal Rights Party. The homely gals weren't jealous of Victoria's good looks and eloquence. They were just happy that their voices were being heard and their issues were being taken seriously by a few people. But a couple of those people were the most prominent women of her time. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, pioneers of the suffrage movement, were captivated by her audacity and determination. So I want to be clear that Victoria's nomination was historic, but in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't viewed as legitimate by most people who even slightly cared about politics. For one, Victoria was only 33 years old, meaning she had not yet reached the constitutionally mandated age of 35 to serve as president. Secondly, Victoria selected Frederick Douglass, the famous black abolitionist, as her running mate. That by itself isn't laughable. He had no clue that he was running on this ticket because she never asked him or told him, and he never accepted the nomination, nor did he acknowledge her campaign. Well, the whole thing just seemed downright ludicrous. His nomination stirred up controversy for sure, and even though Douglass agreed with some of Victoria's opinions, he was too smart to be pulled in and used by her. At the mention of his name, the fear of mixing white and black people immediately jumped into the forefronts of people's brains. Victoria's party was hoping to use the nomination of Douglass to reunite the suffragists with black American civil rights activists. They had been on the same side of issues for a long time, but the 15th Amendment 2 years earlier excluded women suffragists, which understandably caused a rift. Well, Douglass decided for himself that he was not going to be the glue that bonded these two groups together again. This vice presidential nomination from Victoria didn't excite him one bit. He did not attend the Equal Rights Convention. He did not talk about Victoria's nomination. He didn't even put up a vote for Victoria sign in his front yard. This refusal from Douglass was a big slap in the face to Victoria, who thought that a black man should be honored to have his name on the same ticket next to a white woman for the second highest office in the land. Victoria underestimated Douglass's self-worth and intellect. Victoria thought that Douglass needed her, but the truth was that she needed him, and by the time of her presidential campaign, he had garnered more political clout in the past 10 years than she would in her entire life. Douglass had been an advisor to Presidents Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. And quick spoiler alert, though I'm sure you already know, Victoria loses this election and Grant wins. Well, Douglass and Grant had been political allies since the 1860s. Douglass campaigned for Grant in the 1868 election. They were so close, in fact, that Frederick Douglass and his family lived in Grant's home from the 1870s until the early 1900s. There were so many reasons why it was just plain stupid for Victoria to choose Frederick Douglass as her running mate. At the end of the day, Douglass was a conservative and Victoria was not. They shared similar beliefs on a couple of major issues, and perhaps Douglass could have been swayed to join her side, but there is one part of Victoria's story that I rarely see mentioned in writings that might have made it absolutely impossible for Frederick Douglass to consider supporting her. It was her belief in and promotion of eugenics, selective breeding. The desired outcome of eugenics is the existence of a population with desirable characteristics. It disfavors groups thought to be inferior. And when people talk about eugenics, they tend to focus on race and, to a lesser extent, beauty. But it's not all about outward appearance. It encompasses intelligence, birth defects, and mental disabilities. When we pedestalize Victoria Woodhull for being the first female candidate for president, it might make us all a little more comfortable to think that she promoted eugenics as a measure to avoid birthing children with mental disabilities, especially when we think of the poor, innocent teenager who gave birth to her first son, Byron, who had some type of disability, and we know that this troubled her. But Victoria promoted eugenics for another reason. It was closely tied to her feminist agenda, but deeply rooted in white supremacist ideology. She reframed abolitionist arguments about slavery to center on the sexual slavery of marriage, advocating for women's sexual and reproductive independence as essential for racial improvement. Her views aligned eugenics with feminist goals, emphasizing the importance of white women's autonomy in selecting partners to ensure the advancement of the white race. And for Victoria, you had to be the right kind of white to deserve her advocacy. French, Italians, Spaniards, Russians need not apply. She wasn't too fond of poor white women either. She and a certain Austrian-born German politician of the 1930s and 40s had some similarities in their thought patterns. Her rhetoric intertwined ideas of sexual liberation, racial dominance, and societal reform. Her argument for women's sovereignty over their bodies served as a cornerstone for her broader feminist platform, but was also a vehicle for her belief in white supremacy. By linking women's independence to the preservation of Western civilization, Victoria contributed to an early racially charged discourse within feminism. This perspective of her is largely ignored in historical studies. That's exactly why I have to talk about it. It's a hot mess. Every time her name is brought up whenever a woman runs for president and loses, we always get the yay girl power story, but the yay white power story exists too. And I really appreciate Dr. Stephanie Athey exploring this topic more deeply in a brilliant writing on eugenic feminisms for University of Colorado at Boulder. I reached out to Dr. Athey in hopes of getting a better understanding of this part of Victoria Woodhull's life. Not only did she reply, but while she was out on holiday, she recorded this video for us that puts it all in very frank terms.
We have to be careful to see Woodhull as a champion of women's sexual and political empowerment in a very narrow and very ugly sense. Hers was a project that applied to white women, some white women, not all of them. It was meant to free those among them who were mentally fit, physically able-bodied, and ethnically white as possible in a changing demographic influx of immigrants into the late 19th century U.S. To be clear, she argued that women's independence, including their ability to control their, quote, own sex organs and parts, unquote, including their fullest control and pleasure in sex, and their liberation from marriage and monogamy, only these things were the very keys to a stronger white race, and therefore to white supremacy, and therefore to the backbone of health, wealth, and prosperity for the nation. And eventually, as the century wore on, she would argue this freedom in sexual relations for these implicitly white upper-class women would mean the cornerstone of U.S. imperial dominance. She delivered this message on the lecture circuit to crowds in the U.S. and in England, and in her own essays and weekly publications. Quote, "To woman by nature belongs the right of sexual self-determination. When the instinct is aroused in her, then only should sex follow. When woman rises from sexual slavery into freedom, into the ownership and control of her sexual organs, and man is obliged to respect that control and freedom, then will the intensity and glory of her creative functions be increased 100-fold. As to the difficulty of freedom for women," she writes, "there is but one, and that is pecuniary independence." Her message is simple and radical. Only through the very best sex, as women define that sex for themselves, do women make their best babies.
Back to Frederick Douglass. Not only did he not support Victoria, he actively supported Grant. Frederick Douglass was a loyal Republican who supported Grant's run for a second term. Grant had supported a number of civil rights acts in 1870 and 1871. He spoke against the Ku Klux Klan, and he supported sending the Union Army to the South to protect the lives of Black people who wanted to vote. For Frederick Douglass, the choice was clear. I can only imagine Douglass buying a newspaper and reading this headline that he's running for VP with Victoria and saying, say what now? Well, if the Frederick Douglass running mate debacle wasn't enough of a controversy for Victoria's campaign, she had another trick up her lacy sleeve. This one would be the final nail in the coffin of this insane campaign. So, you've probably heard of a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Significant work of American literature, best-selling novel, second best-selling book of the 19th century following only the Bible. It was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a name that many still know today. Well, Harriet's family were famous abolitionists during the period of our story. Henry Ward Beecher isn't a name that people throw around today, but in the 1870s, he may have been more popular than Harriet Beecher Stowe. He was her brother and a renowned preacher. He was the celebrated leader of Brickland's Plymouth Church, a towering figure, charismatic, energetic, and full of life. Henry Beecher held an influence few could match. As an orator, he was unrivaled. As a theologian, he was less impressive. But where he truly excelled was in captivating an audience, winning hearts and inspiring loyalty. The way, for some reason, I see Henry Ward Beecher in a similar light, based on what I've read about him. He was known for his support of the abolition of slavery. His sermons emphasized God's love, and he loved sharing his own love, particularly with the fine sisters in his flock. And by that, I mean that he was slinging his big old penis all over that congregation. Everybody knew about it, but nobody talked about it. That is, until one brave soul decided that he couldn't contain the secret anymore. But his interest in the scandal was more personal than other people's. Because one of those Bible-thumping women Pastor Beecher was having his way with was this guy's wife. This guy is Theodore Tilton, a man who started out as an acquaintance of Victoria's, but they became very chummy after he told Victoria about the affair that the good Reverend was having with his wife. Why did this matter to Victoria? Well, Pastor Beecher agreed with Victoria's positions on abolition and even women's suffrage to a point. But Victoria had some beliefs that he thought were just a little too far to the left for him. For one, she was a spiritualist who believed in multiple spirits that were guiding humans and not God with a capital G. And Beecher disagreed with and preached against Victoria's free love stance. Before, Victoria just saw these issues as differences of opinions between her and the pastor. Now that she knew that he was getting it on with women in his congregation, she saw his public stance on the free love movement as hypocrisy. Now she'd have to expose him. First, she'd give him a warning. She told Harriet and her sister Catherine that they needed to get their brother under control, make him stop talking about her. Well, that was a stupid move on Victoria's part, because the Beecher sisters didn't like Victoria at all. So Henry continued to get in his pulpit and tell his parishioners about Victoria, the harlot, and her Jezebel ways. Victoria had had enough, so she delivered an ultimatum to the Beecher family. Either rein in their beloved Reverend brother, Henry Ward Beecher, or she'd unleash the scandal on them. Yeah, Harriet, no one is going to want to hear another word of your brother's fire and brimstone after I print the story about his affair with Mrs. Tilton in my newspaper. This was not an idle threat. In the November 2nd, 1872 issue of Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, Victoria laid bare the whole sordid affair between Beecher and Elizabeth Tilton. It was a scandalous exposé that tore apart Beecher's carefully cultivated public image as a moral leader. In private, Beecher was a far cry from the pulpit powerhouse. Behind closed doors, he was described as weak and even pitiful, a contrast made all the more glaring against his fierce controlling sisters, Harriet and Catherine. This was not Victoria's smartest move, for she had unwisely underestimated the power of the Beecher family. She printed every detail of Pastor Beecher's affair with Elizabeth Tilton, Theodore's wife. That ended up embarrassing everyone involved. You see, the year prior, Theodore approached Pastor Henry about sleeping with his wife, and almost as if the pastor had Theodore under a spell, he got Theodore to sign a document that damn near said that not only did Theodore know that the pastor was having sex with his wife, he would never talk about it, and he practically condoned the affair. It was insane. And after Victoria published this story on November 2nd, 1872, it backfired on her big time. All that she wanted to do was to point out the double standard between men and women when it came to sex. And she did that, but it came at a price. The very same day she was arrested. The charge, publishing an obscene newspaper. Her sister and her husband were thrown in the slammer too. They were arrested compliments of Anthony Comstock, as in the Comstock Act, the act that makes it criminal for the post office to deliver obscene material. Comstock saw to it that Victoria and Tennessee were held in the Ludlow Street Jail, a jail for hardened criminals. And it wasn't just some overnight stay in jail. She certainly had more than enough money to bail out, but there was no bail. Victoria had to stay behind bars for months. If you caught the date that she got arrested, then you know what that means. Arrested on November 2nd, 1872, election year? It means that Victoria wasn't even able to vote for herself, and she needed every vote she could get. Needless to say, she didn't win the 1872 presidency, but in a race where even the smallest third parties received at least one electoral college vote, Victoria received 0. But she did have one guy in Texas vote for her. As he said, he was just casting a vote against Grant. Even with the multiple candidates who had their hats in the ring, the election of 1872 was the same as every other presidential race. There were only 2 candidates who had a real chance of winning, Grant and Greeley. Grant won. Horace Greeley died right after the election. Victoria was sad, but she didn't take the news quite that badly. But she didn't have too much to smile about, because the Beecher family was not done with her yet. Victoria's determination to bring down Pastor Beecher had negative effects on all of the parties involved. Theodore Tilton sued Beecher for adultery and alienation of affection because now his own manhood was on the line. That trial ended in a hung jury. Speaking of hung, Pastor Beecher had his congregation at the Plymouth Church in Brooklyn to conduct their own investigation of him. And surprise, surprise, they found him innocent. He was allowed to continue preaching. His first order of business was to excommunicate Theodore Tilton. Can you believe it? The adulterous pastor gets to stay. The man who was cheated on has to go. And why the hell was Theodore still a member of that church anyway? You would have had to kick me out. I would have left on my own. Things got so bad for Theodore that he had to leave the country after Victoria's stunt because he could no longer find work. He had to move to Paris. The preacher came out almost unscathed. He continued preaching and sexing up the women in his congregation. He was just no longer seen as the moral authority that he had made himself out to be before Victoria's article. Victoria lived to regret printing that story because after she was released from jail, the Beecher sisters made Victoria's life a living hell. They kept her and Tennessee in court, fighting legal battles over their newspaper. It got so bad that they had to completely shut it down. Woodhull and Claflin's weekly was over. Henry's sisters hated Victoria's guts. There was Harriet Beecher Stowe, and then there was Catherine. Well, Catherine was an anti-suffragist. She didn't think that women should have been allowed to vote, so she thought that Victoria was just way too radical. She didn't like her lifestyle. She looked down on her. So with the help of her famous sister Harriet, she did everything that she could to destroy Victoria's reputation and to disrupt her comfortable life. Now, telling whomever would listen that Victoria was a nut job was one thing, but the Beecher sisters used their influence to get Victoria kicked out of every townhouse and apartment she rented. As soon as she and Tennessee got settled into a place, here came the Beecher sisters, applying pressure on the landlord to evict those heathenous sisters. And it worked, time after time after time. If any landlord tried to let the Claflin sisters live in peace, the Beecher sisters would simply tell all of their followers to go and harass that landlord. Landlords who dared show Victoria and Tenny any sympathy or respect quickly found themselves ostracized, harassed, and coerced into compliance. Victoria was vilified, hounded from every corner, and treated like a social pariah by the Beecher sisters' minions. Something had to give, and it wasn't going to be the Beechers. Their campaign to destroy Victoria was far more successful than her campaign for the presidency. By the time they were done with Victoria, she was nearly bankrupt. Remember all of that money she had? But thankfully for Victoria, her husband, James Blood, still supported her free love movement. He supported it so much that he divorced her. The Beechers had done a darn good job of destroying what was left of Victoria's image. Victoria was done, and by association, so was Tennessee. By 1877, the sisters were surrounded by adversaries, with many eagerly awaiting their downfall. They were out of options in America and in a very desperate position. But just as the odds seemed insurmountable, Commodore Vanderbilt rescued the sisters one last time because he died. Here's what I mean. His death became a lifeline for Victoria and Tennessee thanks to an unexpected twist in his will. Vanderbilt's son, William, inherited the bulk of his father's $90 million fortune. Then almost immediately, whispers circulated about a mysterious settlement involving Tennessee and Victoria. Well, those rumors must have had some truth to them, because everyone knew that the sisters had been seemingly on the brink of financial collapse. But all of a sudden, they departed for England, and they couldn't have done that without money. Gossip suggested that a sum of money had been paid to quietly remove them from the scene, quashing any potential courtroom drama that might expose more scandalous family secrets. After all, Cornelius Vanderbilt's wife was still alive. Nobody needed to know anything more about him and Tennessee than they already knew. Now, I've seen the amount of money that William gave them reported to be as little as $1,000 and as much as $500,000. Whatever it was more than the $0 that the sisters had before. and it allowed them to make their transatlantic getaway. With two powerful families on their tails, each for different reasons, the Claflin sisters couldn't have stayed at home no matter what. So they boarded a ship with nothing but the funds that had just come in, and their good looks still intact. Though it was in a lot of newspapers that Tennessee had put on some weight, because, that's important journalism, to talk about a woman's weight. And guess who was in Europe at the same time as Victoria? Her best friend, former President Grant. As far as America was concerned, it was good riddance to Victoria and her conniving sister. She was another continent's problem now. As the San Francisco Examiner wrote in a brief on August 9, 1877, with Grant, the potato bug, and Victoria Woodhull, Europe will get enough of America this season. End quote. The potato bug was the Colorado potato beetle. In 1877, it reached the UK, where it was first reported in Liverpool. It was a major pest for potato crops. Now, England would have the pleasure of hosting two more pests, Victoria and Tennessee. Their hope was that having distance from their country would also help to distance them from their scandals. If they were ever going to live the good life again, they would need to find men with money to marry them. It took some years, but Victoria was able to get married again. While she was rehashing an old lecture at St. James Hall in London, she met an aristocratic banker named John Martin, who didn't know her story and was willing to take a chance with her. When his mother saw that John was taking his relationship with Victoria seriously, she protested. She forbade him from marrying Victoria, as in, over my dead body. Then she died, and John married Victoria in 1883. October 31st, 1883 to be exact, Halloween, and I'm sure that his mother would have thought that an appropriate day. 2 years later, Tennessee found her happy ending when a wealthy Portuguese viscount named Fred Cook asked her for her hand in marriage. On her wedding day, her favorite people were in attendance, but her honeymoon had an unexpected and uninvited guest, the ghost of her past life with Victoria. A huge exposé was printed about Victoria and Tennessee just days after Tennessee's wedding. It was mostly about Victoria, but of course, talked about the scandalous lives of both women in America. It was a warning to Fred about the family he was marrying into, but it was too late. Might have been more impactful if the story had dropped before the wedding. I couldn't find the original article, but an 1885 edition of the Chicago Tribune published parts of it. Quote, disagreeable stories had been told about her in the contest over the will of old Commodore Vanderbilt. Her name had been mixed up with that of Theodore Tilton in the famous Beecher trial. Her free love principles were well known. The gentleman who married Mrs. Woodhull was regarded as one of the most eligible matches in England. He is young, very rich, a member of a good family, and finely educated. When young Martin made up his mind to marry Mrs. Woodhull, there was a social storm in London. The young man's mother said emphatically that he would never be allowed to marry the woman as long as she lived. So Mr. Martin, like a dutiful son, said nothing more of the engagement until his mother's death, after which he made Mrs. Woodhull his wife. End quote. Now again, this story didn't stop Tenny's marriage, nor did it make her husband or Victoria's husband divorce either one of the women, but it did kill their father. That's according to Victoria. Buck died shortly after the exposé was printed, and this is what Victoria had to say about it from a brief in an 1885 edition of the San Francisco Examiner. Quote, Mrs. Woodhull's father. She claims he died of grief. The Sun prints the following special cable dated yesterday. Sir, my father, Reuben B. Claflin, died yesterday of grief caused by a malicious libel published in The World of October 25th. Has not our family suffered enough? Please insert this notice for a heartbroken family. Victoria Claflin Martin, number 17 Hyde Park Gate, London. End quote. Seemed like maybe, just maybe, the Beecher sisters were still not done with the Claflin sisters, They certainly had the money, power, and influence to keep using the press to avenge their brother. Victoria tried her best to live a quiet life in her third marriage. She took part in the British women's suffrage movement, but she wasn't as loud about it as her other causes. Along with her daughter, Zula, she published a journal called Humanitarian. This went on from 1892 to 1901. The purpose of the journal? The promotion of eugenics. Yes, she never let that go. Victoria and her sister lived to see some women gain the right to vote in Great Britain and in the United States. In Great Britain, the Representation of the People Act of 1918 granted the vote to women over 30 who owned property. 2 years later, the U.S.'s 19th Amendment would grant that right to all women, at least on paper. Women who weren't white continued to face barriers to voting through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and even flat-out exclusion for indigenous Native Americans who weren't considered citizens. But hey, those are just poor white women in the UK and non-white women in the US. Victoria wouldn't have cared about any of them anyway. She died in 1927 at the age of 88. The following year, in Victoria's adopted country of Great Britain, all women aged 21 and over were given the right to vote, regardless of property ownership. Victoria Claflin Woodhull's story is one of many Gilded Age stories that has, as a character in it, Henry Ward Beecher. He was also an important figure in the life of Arabella Huntington. For those of you who watched The Gilded Age, the Sylvia Chamberlain character is based on her. Well, Arabella's second husband, a very rich man, was already married when she started dating him. It was a scandal, and the only clergyman who would touch that union with a 10-foot pole was none other than Henry Ward Beecher. He married them. I published a story about her hot mess of a life that you can see here. I'll also leave links to it in the description box and in the pinned comment. I want to give a heartfelt thank you to Dr. Stephanie Athey for her valuable insights that enriched this documentary. Her book, Torture in the National Security Imagination, is an incredible read. I purchased a copy recently and have been thoroughly enjoying it. You can learn more about Dr. Athey and her work at stephanieathey.com. Be sure to check it out. I have her link placed in the top of the description box here and in the pinned comment of this video. My sources for this story are the Brooklyn Daily Times Archives, 1871, New York Herald Archives, 1872, Brooklyn Eagle Archives, 1874, Chicago Tribune Archives, 1885, the San Francisco Examiner Archives, 1877 and 1885, Fort Worth Star Telegram Archives, 1927, Recalling Another Strange Historic Election by Colleen Walsh for the Harvard Gazette, and the Fresno Bee Archives, 1960. This video has been brought to you by me. Well, my Patreon is the sponsor for this video. If you like these dirty scandals on my channel, then you'll love my Patreon, Ties Too Hot Mess History. It has all of the stuff that I can't talk about or show here because it's just too hot, too violent, too sexual, too graphic, too much. Come and join us there for the hot mess history. The link is in the description box.